Well, Thomas Hobbes is usually associated with the scientific developments of the 17th century. And that is not, of course, wrong, for he knew Galileo. There are seats at the front. There are always seats at the front. You don't have to stand. He knew Galileo, whom he described as the greatest thinker of any age. He debated with Descartes, and he himself wrote extensively on physics and on mathematics. However, Hobbes was a child of the Elizabethan age, born in 1588, and he originally received his training in the so-called humanistic disciplines central to Renaissance scholarship. Furthermore, I want to argue this evening, he never lost these humanistic allegiances, and hence, to a remarkable degree, an identity as a Renaissance philosopher. And nowhere, this is my specific argument, is this identity more evident than in his abiding interest. I mean, you can't imagine this with someone like Descartes. His abiding interest in the relationship between text and image, and hence in the visual representation of the basic principles of his civil philosophy. But we need to start by saying something about the humanistic disciplines, if I'm going to make good this point, in relation to visual culture. When I speak of Hobbes's humanist training, I just mean that he followed the disciplines of the Studia Humanitatis at the University of Oxford. There were, of course, only two universities at the time I'm speaking of, and Oxford, which Hobbes went to in 1604, had these humanist statutes in force since 1564. And the curriculum that prescribed comprised 5 elements, the first being grammar, by which, of course, they meant the study of the Latin language, but that was not part of the university curriculum, or not officially, because you were meant to have mastered that particular skill before you arrived at university at grammar school, hence, of course, the name. And indeed, I haven't worked on the sources in Oxford for this period, but I've worked a lot on the Cambridge sources for the late 16th and early 17th century. And there was, in most colleges, an examination on the first day when you arrived, because, of course, it was illegal in the college statutes for you to speak anything except Latin within the precincts of the college. And so there was an oral examination in Latin when you arrived. And I discovered quite a large number of people arrived on the 1st of October and left on the 2nd of October. If you survived that test, then your first 2 years at Oxford were spent on the 2 major beginning elements of the Studia Humanitatis, rhetoric and poetry. In rhetoric at Oxford, you studied Aristotle's rhetoric. That was very unusual, but Hobbes would have had those lectures available to him. And you studied Cicero's De Oratore and Quintilian's Institutio. And then under the heading of poetry, what is on the syllabus is Homer, of course, but also Horace, and above all, the Renaissance favourite, Ovid. And all of that is for you to learn the theory and the practice of eloquent speech. And then you proceeded to the 2 final elements of the Studia Humanitatis, history and moral philosophy, which were generally taught together because the study of history was largely devoted to finding examples of good and evil, and of wise and imprudent behaviour. So history was really treated as moral philosophy teaching by examples. Now, this entire curriculum is highly practical. It just has one aim, which is to teach you how to read and to write in the most persuasive style. And as I say, that's eminently practical because essentially Oxford and Cambridge, in the period of which I'm speaking, were training grounds for the clergy. Indeed, my own statistic, but if you compute for the late Elizabethan, early Stuart period, of all students who graduated in those 2 universities, 90% become clergymen. And of course, the remainder, the 10%, go into law, and some go into politics. And if you take those 3 professions together, the church and law and politics, what is in common is, as a requisite, is obviously skill in public speaking, then as now. But there was also an intellectual reason for this focus, and that is based on the idea that there are 2 kinds of academic discipline. And the distinction is the one that they would have known, was the one articulated by Cicero in the De Oratore, his distinction between cases where it's possible to demonstrate, and cases where there can only be argumenta in utramque partem. If you can demonstrate, then there is no argument on the other side, ex hypothesi. But where demonstration is not possible, there will always be argumenta in utramque partem. And the latter is always going to be true in what Cicero already calls the human sciences, and most obviously in the law, which is never far from his mind. And the setup of the law courts, of course, then, as now, centred on the idea that there are two sides to the question, there are two sides to the case. There's the case for the prosecution, there's the case for the defence. And I need to stress this idea of the argumenta in utramque partem, because it's fundamental to the idea of rhetorical argument, and it's also going to turn out to be crucial to the iconography that I'm going to concentrate on later. I just need to say once again, for people who are standing, that you could sit. There are seats at the front. Let me do it. Okay, if in universities what you're basically doing is training people in the art of public speaking, and if in the human sciences there are always going to be two sides to the question, in any legal, any moral, any political issue, then the key question is this. How can you present an argument in such a way as to get people on your side? There are two sides, and both are going to have arguments. So how do you get people on your side? Well, that's what the theory of rhetoric promised to teach. That's the whole point. And that's why rhetoric has to be the first thing you learn at university. And if you look at the great classical rhetoricians, I mean, of course, it's the Roman tradition that they're interested in rather than Aristotelian discussion of emphathemes, then you will find that they offer an answer which can be represented, this is a crude representation, but not too crude, I think, as essentially in three steps. First, you can't hope in the human side, you can't hope in law, you can't hope in morals or politics to win an argument by demonstrative means. That's again, true ex hypothesi. So what you've got to do, amongst other things, if you're going to win the argument, and here they do have an Aristotelian thought, is you want to add pathos to logos. You've got to know how to add pathos to logos. You've got to learn, that is, how to rouse the emotions. You've got to move people round to your side, to your point of view. So the basic idea in the Latin is really a pun on the Latin verb movere. You can move people round to your point of view, and the word would be movere, to move them. But the question is how to do that, and the answer is, well, you do that by moving their emotions, by arousing their emotions, and the Latin would still be movere. And of course, we still invoke the idea of very powerfully eloquent speech as a kind of physical force. In the presence of a great orator, what do you say? You say, I was transported. I was carried away. These are highly physical metaphors. And in parliamentary oratory, as perhaps you know, because there are two sides, as there are in the House of Commons still, well, we have three parties, well, not really. There are two sides to the question, so there have to be two sides to the House. But the great feat of our parliamentary oratory, and Burke once managed it, would be to cause an opponent to cross the floor. So he's so moved that he moves. That's rhetoric. Okay, how do you move the emotions of an audience? That's step two. Well, there are many, many ways, of course. That's not a simple question. But Quintilian is very interested in one in particular, which he singles out under the heading of what he calls vividness. You have to have vividness, and he uses the Greek, energeia. You have to have energeia, which interestingly he translates as representatio. And representatio is the capacity, as he says, it's his phrase, to see something oculum mentis, in the mind's eye. That's to say, the representation of what you're talking about is so vivid, has so much energeia, that it is as if I see it. It's not a description, it's a picture. And that is why, as you remember, Quintilian thinks that Homer is incomparably the greatest of the poets, because he never describes, he always gives you a picture. That's Quintilian's claim. In any case, you can always, as he says, see the scene in your mind's eye. So you're trying to turn auditors into spectators. That's another of Quintilian's phrases. And the question is, how do you do that? Well, there are two major arguments here, and the first is classical, and it's well known to us all because it's the third part of the 5 parts of Ciceronian rhetoric. You do this by figurae, by adding figures to your speech, figures of speech. We still speak of imagery, don't we, as the general term for figures of speech. And why is that? Well, because we're trying to produce images. We're trying to get a representation of something. And the figures of speech will be what enables you, instead of having a description, to have an image. Language that makes you see things. The second argument is added with the revival of classical rhetoric in the Renaissance, which is that what you want to do, and especially if what we have is written eloquence, where of course only the first 3 of the 5 classical features are present, if we're talking about written eloquence, then we don't just want figures of speech, but we want actual figures in your text, that is, pictures. And notice that even nowadays, this is a Renaissance usage, but we've never given it up. If you have an illustration in the text of the book, it's called a figure. Figure 1, figure 2, figure 3. Because this is like a figure of speech, but it's an actual figure. Now, this idea of figuration in both these senses gives rise to 2 developments in the mid-16th century which much preoccupy me. And the first is the emergence of a particular genre of books which is characteristic of the High Renaissance, the books of emblemata, emblem books. These are books, as you know, of moral and religious edification, and they consist of a series of moral tales, often in Latin verse, and they're often examples of proverbs, and then there's a picture. So usually on the left-hand side you would have the picture, and on the right-hand side you would have the illustrative moral verse. Usually in rhymed Latin verse, because memory. Verse is easier to remember, and rhymed verse is easier than anything to remember. Now, and the picture on the other side, because of course pictures move you more than words. Pictures are images, so they have a greater moving force. Now, these books they're enormous in number, thousands as far as I can see. I mean, certainly I've looked at hundreds. They're usually very primitive in the early phase. The early phase would be 1540s, 1550s, because they're just woodcuts. But there's a very important technological development in the mid to late 16th century, which is the replacement of woodcuts with the capacity to insert copper engravings into your text. Bowen and Imhoff have done a major study of this technological development, and they concentrate on the French printer Christophe Plantin, who worked in Antwerp in the 1560s. But in fact, there are earlier instances in Italian printing in the 1550s, the most notable being the final version of Acciato's Emblemata, published in 1550, the year of his death, which moves from the woodcuts, which were how he was illustrated from the very beginning of the publication of that great work of Emblemata. 1531 is the first edition. It was woodcuts all the way through, but then it becomes copper engravings. And the first example of an emblem book which is copper engraving in England is Whitney's Choice of Emblems, 1585. So there's one development that interests me. The other is very closely connected, and you might actually say, well, it's just an instance of the first. Not quite an instance, but very closely connected, which is the emergence, in the second half of the 16th century, datable, and there's been good scholarship on this, of frontispiece. You open a book, what's the first thing you see? If it has a frontispiece, the first thing you see is a representation, a representatio, an account in visual terms of the essence of the argument of the book that you are about to read. And the whole point is that this makes the doctrine of the book much more memorable and much more persuasive, because that's what pictures do. Now, this edition of frontispieces is not general, especially in engraving. I mean, the 16th century works I've discussed, they're very expensive. It's very expensive to the technology of inserting entirely into letterpress is very expensive. So this is not for ordinary books. And it's mainly confined to works of a clear pedagogical intent. And so it's not surprising, I think, to find, anyway, it's true, that the books that begin to appear with frontispieces are works in the three major genres of the Studia Humanitatis: poetry, history, moral philosophy. Nor, I think, is it surprising, anyway, again, it's true, that it's particularly in translations that first begin to proliferate around this time of classical texts in these genres that frontispieces appear, and quickly become, not at first, but quickly become iconographically quite complicated, especially with the technological change, because once, of course, you can replace a woodcut with a copper engraving, you can have enormously much more complicated iconographical effects. So, first of all, you begin to find frontispieces added to translations of classical poetry. As I've said, the favourite classical poet in this period is Ovid, so let's take him as an example. There's a very simple woodcut, the frontispiece of Arthur Golding's translation of the Metamorphoses, 1565. Not such a simple woodcut, but if you move on a generation, wow. Here is the 1626 translation with a very complex iconography, of course, now in an engraving. Well, what do you see? You see the elements. At the top left is fire with salamander, and right is air, and of course at the bottom there's Mother Earth on the left, and on the right Neptune, so that is water. And in the middle you see the most famous of all the Metamorphoses, which is Circe's transformation of Ulysses' men into pigs. The moral, which is meant to be the moral that you're drawing from your reading with Ovid, if he is a poet you know well, you will see that the moral is a little bit pedagogical and perhaps a bit optimistic, which is that love is not the dominating power. Amore, love is on the left, and of course the dominance would always be on the right, and on the right is, luckily, wisdom. And if you put wisdom together with love, you get virtue, which is what, of course, you want, and virtue can triumph, which, as you see, there she is in her triumphal car at the top. That's not how I read Ovid, but never mind. That's the principle that you're being introduced to in the text. Well, the greatest of the poets, as we've already said, is universally agreed to be Homer, and here's the frontispiece to Chapman's great translation of the Iliad of 1615. Now here, a bold attempt to summarize for you something like the essence of the moral of the poem. Notice here, two sides to the question. And of course, war is always being figured as the great example. Shakespeare can't get away from this thought. War is the example of two sides to the question. Was and is the question of these wars, as is said in old Hamlet. Why? There are two sides to the question always in a war, and so here you have Achilles on the left and Hector on the right, the two sides, and also the opposed gods who supported the different sides. Vulcan there on the left, who forged the armour of Achilles, and Apollo, recognisable by his lyre, who supported the cause of Troy. But what I want to concentrate on is the frontispieces of increasing complexity that you find in the translation of the classical works in the two other linked genres of the Studia Humanitatis that I've mentioned. That's to say, history and moral philosophy. So let's turn first to moral philosophy, the culminating the culminating discipline. Here we go back in time a little. This is a very early example of a printed frontispiece, a very crude woodcut, the date 1553. This is the title page to the first ever English translation of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Mainly decorative, as we see in this early stage, and that's still true if you look forward only a little to the first bilingual edition of the De Efficies, undoubtedly the most widely read work of moral philosophy of the Renaissance. Quite a crude and certainly very straightforward placing of the title into a woodcut. However, again, If you move on a generation, and with this big technological change, you find iconographically much more complicated frontispieces. Look at this spectacular one, which is the title page of Thomas Lodge's 1620 translation of Seneca, Seneca's moral works. So what do you see here? Well, you really see the preoccupations of Seneca's Stoicism. You see Nero on the left, which of course is a pun. This isn't invariably the case, but as I don't need to remind you, the Latin word for left is sinister. If you translate that into English, you might be looking for a particularly sinister figure. And if you're looking for a particularly sinister figure, and who more sinister than Nero, you will always find him on the left. As here you do. Opposing him, two sides to the question. Opposing him is what? The figure of temperance. This is not a very usual iconography for temperance, but it's a perfectly clear one. She has two goblets and she is watering wine. It's a quite familiar, yes, it's a high Florentine. You find this on the Duomo in Florence. She waters wine, which of course is an act of temperance. And that temperance is associated with the Stoicism of Seneca, who is shown below temperance. That's to say, temperance dominates him. There's always this up and down visual metaphor in the frontispieces. Above is the dominating figure. You are under, that's to say, you are under the power of, under the influence of temperance, in this case, as Seneca is. But his Stoicism and its constancy can only have one outcome under Nero, and that is death by his tyranny. And there in the centre is Seneca dying in his bath. Very complex piece of iconography there. And you find, similarly, the same story to be told if we turn to the final of the elements of the Studi Hermeneuticus that I'm talking about, history. Here's a very early example. Alexander Barclay's translation, 1557. We're back in the 50s here. Translation of Sallust's two remaining histories. Again, notice it's a woodcut. It's actually the simplest we've seen, isn't it? Very straightforward, purely decorative. No iconography, really, except that these are figures of support, and we'll come back to that. But again, if you move on a generation, you'll find something much more complex. Here is Julius Caesar's commentaries with Clement's observations. This is 1609. Two sides to the question. It's again the question of a war. And you see the two sides. The right side is the dominant, of course, and so that is Caesar. The left side is Pompey. Here, although it's a poor reproduction, I'm sorry, you see the frontispiece of Anthony Coates' translation, 1590, of the relevant portions of Livy's history. That's to say, the war with Hannibal. Two sides to the question once again. Well, here you see victory at the top, winged victory, holding the laurel crown. But the two supporting figures, this is very important, are the ones that show you why it was that Rome triumphed over Hannibal. Why? Hannibal is just a barbarian, but the supporting figures which explain Rome's triumph are on the left, Justice, who's recognizable by her sword, and on the right, Prudence, recognizable by her snake. St. Matthew, you remember, be as prudent as the serpent. And there is Prudence with her serpent. Those are the qualities that brought Rome her victory, and that's what you're going to read about in the book. Now, staying with history, of all the ancient historians, everyone agreed, except Dionysius of Halicarnassus, that the greatest historian was Thucydides. Dionysius didn't agree because he thought he was, but as Hobbes says in his translation, nobody agreed. The greatest of the translations of the historians is Thucydides. So one of the most taxing humanist challenges would be to translate him, especially as Thucydides' Greek is really impossible, of legendary difficulty. Now, the humanist scholar in the Renaissance who carries off the prize of being the first person to translate Thucydides directly from the Greek into English is Thomas Hobbes. It's a spectacular work of humanism. Hobbes' main translation is the Thucydides, but by no means his only one. His early works are translations of classics. His first work of translation, which he never published, was a translation of Aristotle's Rhetoric from Greek into Latin. The Latin text you can still see at Chatsworth. And then he made a translation of the Latin text into English, which is his second published work, The Brief of the Art of Rhetoric, 1637. But his first published work is his translation of Thucydides, published in 1629, with this spectacular frontispiece. You learn a lot about Thucydides' book from this representation. If you look at the base, you see that it's a war, and of course there are two sides to the question, and there are going to be therefore two major figures, and there they are. But you see that the war is fought by land and sea, which you might not have known. You see at the top that the war is between Athens and Hellas. No, sorry, Sparta and Athens. The central panels show Archidamus, the leader of the Spartans at the outbreak of the war, and Pericles, confronting each other. Two sides to the question. But you could also learn the moral of the story, because in effect you learn from this why Sparta won the war. If you look at the panel at the bottom left, quite Aristotle, it says, you see how Sparta was ruled throughout the war. Actually, you don't quite, because Sparta's constitution had 2 kings and 5 ephors. There are 7 figures here, but on the left there's just 1 king. He's wearing a crown, if you can see it, and he has a scepter in his right hand. There is an act of deliberation going on here. Someone has the open palm of Rhetoric, you see in the middle, and is arguing a point. Somebody else is learnedly consulting a book. The king is listening. This is how Sparta was governed. Contrast that on the right, where it says hoi polloi, with how Athens was governed. There's a demagogue who is haranguing the hoi polloi. There's no deliberation going on. Some of them aren't even listening, some of them seem to be leaving. The strong interpretation is that if that's how Athens was governed, how could she conduct a war? And of course that is part of Thucydides' point. Notice also how Hobbes echoes what had by now become a series of humanist conventions about frontispieces and the importance of books. One of these, I've already alluded to this, and I want to bring it out now, is that books are very precious and rather fragile things. Their titles need support. You need people defending, protecting the title. It's like protecting a legal title. Think of that use of the term. Or your title of nobility, your title. Titles need to be protected. And we always see the titles being protected. Here are people with weapons next to the title. They are supporters. They're acting, you might say, as pillars of strength. So they are associated with pillars. Notice the 2 pillars next to these opposed figures. But notice the 2 figures next to the opposed figures here. And notice the same thing here. And notice it again. Here, they are actually upholding the title. Notice the metaphor. They are indeed physically upholding the title. And they have drawn swords. They're protectors. The other convention which you see, and you see it in the frontispiece that you're looking at, is that frontispieces are liminal spaces. They're thresholds. They enact the metaphor of drawing you into the book. They're the first thing you see. They're also the title page. And if you turn the page, you're drawn into the book. But here you are, literally drawn in. And you're drawn through the recession of the perspective into a scene of battle. If you go back to the Ovid, you see it again. If you go back to the Hobbes, you see it again. two supporters standing next to pillars, both armed, guarding the title, and the perspective drawing you into scenes of war. So there's Hobbes's frontispiece, and in the rest of this talk, in the second half, you'll be relieved the second half is not as long as the first half. I'm going to stay with Hobbes, and I want to focus on his moral and political philosophy and the role of iconography in it. Now, as I began by saying, Hobbes is usually presented in the critical literature, not wrongly, as someone who, because he boasted of this himself at the start of his De Cive, 1642, established moral and political theory on a scientific basis. As he says in the preface to the De Cive, the science of politics is a study no older than this book. But as we've seen, Hobbes is also a student of the humanities, and insofar as this is a lecture about Hobbes as a moral philosopher, what I want to argue is that in presenting his scientific and especially geometrical political theory, Hobbes retains his humanist allegiances nonetheless, and nowhere more clearly than in his interest in the visual representation of his thoughts. He never gives up that allegiance which you here see, that a frontispiece is the way to summarize a book and to make it more memorable and to make it more persuasive. So let's turn to the De Cive. And if you buy your De Cive, by the way, it was a very rare book, you couldn't buy it. The first edition was only printed and not published, and he just printed for his friends. Only 12 copies survive. But if you find it on Amazon, you'll be lucky. Here is the frontispiece. Another highly iconographically complex, very little studied frontispiece. Okay, first thought is, what makes me want to say that Hobbes approved of this? That's a very good question, and here is a very good answer. This is the manuscript of the frontispiece of the De Cive in the presentation manuscript given by Hobbes to his patron, the Earl of Devonshire, in 1641, as you see here, although the printing, of course, is 1642. And I think you will agree, it's probable, by the way, that Hobbes drew this himself. He was very proud of his skills as a draftsman, and he drew all the maps in his Thucydides. But whether or not he drew it himself, you will have to agree that it's the same idea. In fact, it's the same design. And he would scarcely, I think, have allowed the printing if he didn't approve of the design, and it's his own design. So let's return to it. Well, what you see here is very clearly in two parts, isn't it? There's an entablature with the word religio written across it, and think of above and below. Always very crucial. What's above? Well, above is the Last Judgment scene, with the crucial above and below pun. Human life goes on under religion. It's physically there in front of you. Under the word religion, under religion, goes on the whole of human life. Notice also how Hobbes follows the humanist conventions of the frontispiece. There are two sides to the question. Imperium on the left, libertas on the right. They're not associated with pillars, except in the sense that they both stand on the plinths of pillars and are themselves pillars. But they are armed and opposed figures who confront each other, and also they confront each other as supporters of the title. There is the title standing between them, and they support. Now, what you're being shown, obviously, is that under religion there are two alternative possibilities for human life: freedom or power. Life under freedom or life under imperium. Suppose you choose imperium, submission to supreme power. What do you get? Well, you get justice. That's what you see. In her left hand is the sword of justice, that's to say the punitive justice. In her right is the scales, which is the invariable symbol of distributive justice. So justice is a product of imperium. That's one of the things you're being told. And of course that's an absolutely fundamental theme of the book. And as a result of submitting to power, you not only gain justice, but you gain the fruits of justice, and that's what you see, if you can see, and I hope you can, in the background. And what are those fruits? They are security and prosperity. There's a sunlit city on a hill. There is a peaceful gathering of a fruitful harvest. Very strong hint about political obligation. What if you think, no, I choose liberty? Bad idea. There's no one to protect you here. You're going to have to protect yourself. So you're going to have a bow and arrow. This is completely uncivilized. Look at the robes, the Romanesque robes of imperium, and now look at the semi-naked, semi-undressed, certainly, figure of freedom. Notice also that this is a face of fear. Contrast the serenity of the face here with the anguish of the face here. This is a very strange image of liberty, I should say. I've spent ages trying to find the light, but I've concluded that it is actually iconographically unique. Because liberty is almost always portrayed in all the Emblem books, I could have given you 100 examples, as a positive value. Of course, liberty, we all want to be free, but not at all in Hobbes. It is an anguished condition. And so it occurred to me there's a big question about the provenance of this image. And I think I've solved that problem. There are two visual traditions being represented here, one of which comes from one of the most famous iconographical manuals of the early 17th century, Cesare Ripa's Iconologia, first published in 1711. Look at this. This is America, but the similarities are remarkable. Again, similar semi-undress, this sort of miniskirt thing, and also a bow in her left hand, as in Hobbes, and an arrow in her right hand, as in Hobbes. But I don't think that's the most important part, that surely Hobbes has got that in his mind, but even more he's got this in his mind. This is Theodore de Brie's engraving from John White's watercolour for Thomas Harriot's book on Virginia, published in 1590, in which White had shown an Algonquin chief in the British Library's watercolour, wonderful watercolours. They had the exhibition a few years ago, didn't they? But what de Brie has done is he's put in the same figure in reverse, hasn't he? He's doubled it. So he's shown you the back view, and he's placed them in a fanciful landscape. This is his main addition in de Brie's engraving, and what you can see, I hope you can see, is 4 braves in the background with huge bows and arrows, and they're hunting a stag, aren't they, which you can see just over on the right. Can you see all that? That is important because of this. What you see here are 4 figures armed with bows and arrows, and they are hunting, but what are they hunting? They are hunting a fellow human being. And in case they miss, there is a 4th figure standing with a club ready to strike them down. Yet more sinister, in the background at the right, behind the skirt, you see what appears to be a scene of human sacrifice. And notice that by contrast with life under Imperium, there is no cultivation. There's no peaceful hill city. What is there? There are defensive palisades. The city didn't even have walls, but here all there is a palisade. So what is happening here is that you're being introduced to the argument of the book, and you really are being given a summary of the argument, because what I have shown you and what Hobbes is arguing already just on the frontispiece, just on the title page, is liberty is what you intuitively think is appealing, but you'd be a fool to choose it. Submission to supreme power, contrary to your intuitions, is in what is in your interests. And that is what you've learned just by looking at the frontispiece of Hobbes' text. So you think, I see, this is a book about how only power produces law, and only Imperium produces that. Well, after 1642, Hobbes turns away from moral and political theory and he tries to write his treatise on physics, the De Corpore, which takes him most of the 1640s, and it doesn't work, and he doesn't publish until 1655. But he tells us in his autobiography that he suddenly stopped working in 1649 because of his strong desire to respond to what he called, of course he's writing after the Restoration and making all this up, the treasonous execution of Charles I. And he decided to write a book on politics for the English, he says. And he did indeed write a book on politics, not only for the English, but for the first time in English. And that is his Leviathan, published in April 1651. Now, again, my point is, he is true to his humanist origins. We're in the 1650s now, but he still wants there to be a complex iconographical frontispiece to summarize the moral of the book. Now, this is the very famous image. You will know it, of course, but although it's a famous image, I do not myself think it has been at all well understood, and I want to end by focusing on it. Well, as before, the first question to ask is, well, what makes us think that Hobbes approved of this image? I mean, you know, publishers will do anything, won't they? They might have stuck this in from somewhere else. What makes us think, especially as Hobbes was in Paris when this was being printed in London, that he wanted this printed? Well, the answer is this. This is Hobbes's manuscript of Leviathan, which you can find in the British Library. And this is the copy that he presented to the future King Charles II in 1650. And this is its frontispiece. Now, this frontispiece is not by any means identical with the other frontispiece. Instead of there being small figures who make up this colossus, you simply see their heads. That's the main difference. The figures, here you just see their heads. Otherwise, except for small changes to the presentation of the city in the foreground, especially to the cathedral, it is identical. Now, this is a pen drawing, somewhat effaced, as you see. It's probably by Wenceslas Holler. Noel Malcolm has established that. But my point is this: Hobbes would never have presented this to the king if he didn't approve of the frontispiece. So if he approved of that frontispiece, then he certainly approved of that one. And I think you could surely agree that that's an argument. So there we are. Now, I've said I don't think this famous image is properly understood, and the reason is that it hasn't been properly contextualized. And I want to end with two brief contextualizations. There will be a huge amount more work to be done on this, but let me make what seem to me the two obvious points. Consider first the contextualization of this simply with respect to this. Here is Hobbes's frontispiece of the De Cive, of which the Leviathan is an expansion and a translation. There are three astonishing changes. First of all, Hobbes had shown all human life under religion. But now look at this. Religion is gone. That's a little bit remarkable. It's simply gone. The dominating and protecting Colossus is not under anyone. He is above everything. And if you can read the Latin on the top, it says, there is no power comparable over the earth, super terram. He is super, he's over everything. And he is, notice, over, under. He is dominating. He is over. We are under him. And indeed, he does have all power. He has the sword of justice in his right hand, and he has a crozier, symbol of ecclesiastical authority, in his left. He holds all civil and ecclesiastical power. Notice, second point, this authority does not now come from above, it comes from below. It comes from the united powers of the individual members of the multitude who are shown as making up the corpus politicum. They make up a political body. It's not a natural body. You've never seen a sovereign. I mean, I've not met the Queen, but I bet you she's not made up of lots of little people. This is not a natural man or woman. It is an artifice, and it is made up from the people. That's to say, and notice how deep the punning goes, they arm the sovereign. They are his arms. Without his being armed by the people, the sword falls from his grasp. If the people disappear, his arm disappears. It is made up of the people. So the subjects arm him with his strength. All power comes from not the people as a unity, because that seems to require the enforcing figure, but from the multitude. All power comes from the multitude of the people. Third, extraordinary change. Remember that we were presented here with a choice. Imperium on the left, libertas on the right. Here there's no choice. You could say this image is, as it were, later in time. The choices have been made. There is no opposing forces. There's no argumentum in utramque partem. We've moved beyond rhetoric. This is not going to be a work of rhetoric. This is a work of science. There are no two sides to the question. There is just the dominating figure, who is the figure of Imperium. The choice has been made, and everything is under him. And notice, in another extremely important visual pun, we, the members of the multitude, look up to his face. They're all looking up to his face. They're facing away from us, looking up to him. And we say, I look up to him, meaning I respect. Well, there's the first context, just the relationship of this to the de Cive frontispiece. That's an extraordinary set of changes. But of course, I want to end by considering the broader humanist context of the iconographical tradition that I've sketched. What do we expect to see if we think of the extraordinarily strongly established conventions of Renaissance iconography with respect to frontispieces? Well, we expect to see supporting pillars of strength. Here are some supporting pillars of strength. Here in Hobbes are supporting pillars of strength. And here they still are, a little more vestigially, but the same iconographical organization in Hobbes. Now that's completely disappeared. That whole idea has completely disappeared. Second thing, remember this. We expect to be welcomed into the book through the frontispiece. The frontispiece is a liminal space. It is a threshold. Here's another threshold. No threshold here. No welcoming you into the space. It's an eyeballing. It's a confrontation. You're faced with an unblinking stare. Let's look lastly at the Colossus, whose unchallenged imperium is associated with two obvious consequences. Notice that again, imperium is associated with peace and prosperity, as it was in de Cive. There's an orderly city in the front. There's a river over on the right, if you could see it, which is busy with trade. The villages are not fortified. Very important point. The sea is dotted with merchant shipping, and the whole thing is bathed in sunlight, especially the city. The light is extremely strong. Although since it's coming from the east, as we know from the orientation of the cathedral, we must be in southern Europe because it's morning, and yet the sun is extremely strong. But far more important for me is, well, what does sunlight mean in the iconography? The sunlight always means glory. This is the light of the world. So it's almost blasphemous. That's the light of the world. Religion has disappeared from the iconography. Now, the second point I want to make is again about the over and the under, which is so critical to the whole iconographical scheme of things. What is under the city? Well, under the city is what has to be kept beneath the surface. What do you have to keep under the city, beneath the surface of the city? Well, this. And here is the lower panel. Now this is complex and brilliant. You have to read across and down. Reading across, you find overmighty subjects. There's the ducal coronet under the castle, and there underneath is the cannon, which is also firing from the ramparts of the castle. Reading across, the castle is the equivalent to the cathedral, and underneath the cathedral is the mitre, which is the equivalent to the coronet, the mitre being the bishop's crown, and equivalent to the thunder of the cannon is the iconographical, this is simply standard iconography. That is a thunderbolt, and that is the thunderbolt of execution, which is what ecclesiastical power can offer, just as the overmighty subject can offer a canon, which you notice is pointing directly at the Commonwealth. Now, if that is allowed, what results? Read across and down again. You get division. You get two sides to the question. You get dangerous division on the left with lots of very dangerously pointed weapons, pikes and swords. But on the right you also get dangerously pointed weapons, which are marked syllogism, and see the horns, which are marked dilemma. So these are also pointed and dangerous, just as they are. These are the dangerous weapons of the clergy if they get out of control, just as the other is the dangerous weapons of the laity if they get out of control. And at the bottom, notice the lower depths. This is as bad and as deep as you can go. You see the result. Battle. Challenge to a unified authority. And there you have the challenge on the left, which is actually a cavalry charge with pikemen in the background. But the challenge on the right is the church making up its own ecclesiastical law. There they are in consistory, recognisably with the tall berettas of princes of the Roman Catholic Church. Notice finally one very remarkable iconographical feat that Hobbes has contrived, which is the idea of pillars as supporters. If we go back to the main picture, you can see that in a way these are pillars, but they are not supporters of Leviathan. They are means to subvert it. They are columns, but they must be kept under. And that's the hugely important visual pun. Well, I've been saying all through that and here I am, the purpose of humanist frontispieces is to introduce you to the argument of the book, of visual representation in summary form. So what's the moral here? Surely it's not in doubt. You must submit yourself entirely to the combined powers of a single person of overwhelming authority. All civil authority, all ecclesiastical authority. There must be none of this nonsense which must be kept under. You must all look up to him. He must be a figure of awe as well as majesty. And that is what happens when you turn the multitude into this artificial body politic. It keeps faction under, it enables absolute power to flourish. So there's the moral, except that the most obvious question that surely any reader would have asked themselves is, well, who is this Colossus, or what is it? What is being represented here? And I think that is not at all clear, and would not at all have been clear to an original reader of the book. So you're going to have to read the book. This is a rather different thought. It's encouraging you into it. Now, it's often said that this is the figure of the sovereign, but that can't possibly be right, because sovereigns are natural persons. A man or a woman is the sovereign. Under Queen Elizabeth, the sovereign was a woman. Under Charles I, the sovereign was a man, but they're both natural persons. This looks a bit like Charles I, but that's just his head. The crowned head is someone bearing the attributes of sovereignty. The imperial crown and the sword of justice. But notice that this sovereign is disembodied without the people. So this whole Colossus, he is not the sovereign, although he must have something to do with the sovereign. So who is he? Or what is he? I think the answer is twofold. First of all, the source in the Old Testament, which you see at the very top there, the reference is given, it's the book of Job. And the Leviathan, which is what you're looking at, as the title says, is a sea monster, the figure of incomparable power who rises out of the sea. And here is a figure of incomparable power rising out of the sea, from the north, notice. But as the title says, this is Leviathan, and if you turn the page to the introduction to the book, Hobbes says the book is called Leviathan, that is the Commonwealth or state. he uses the word state. So I think, and this is the second point, and this is what's amazing about this frontispiece, is this is an attempt, the first ever attempt, so far as I'm aware, in Renaissance iconography, to represent the idea that the state is the name of an artificial person, not a natural person, represented by a natural person. Of course, the state is a persona ficta, so it must be represented, and there is the head of state. That's why it's just the head. He's the head of state, and he is the sovereign. But what you're looking at is an attempt to represent the idea of the state as a persona ficta, and yet the bearer of all power. So, to draw to a close, you might say that this is a sense in which we are, after all, at a liminal moment. The moral philosophy of the Renaissance had emphasized the virtues of individual rulers. But that is all challenged here with the thought that power is not naturally located at all. The locus of power, the person who sends you to jail, the person who makes the laws, is the state. The state is just a fiction and has to be represented by a head of state. But the fundamental thought is, here, we're giving up personal ideas of power for something very modern, which is the impersonal idea of the sovereign state. And that, I think, is what is being pictured. Thank you very much.